In mid-December 2020, a video game developer and publisher, Top Hat Studios, announced that Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story, will be released on Nintendo Switch next year on January 7th, 2021. The game had already been released on PC on August 25th last year, so it had been out for about 5 months by then. The game was also crowdfunded on Kickstarter in June 2018 after failing to get funded the first time in 2017. So what is Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story exactly? It's a 2.5D horror adventure game inspired by Clock Tower and Fatal Frame games, mixing cyberpunk with traditional Cantonese folklore about ghosts and evil spirits. Sense intended to return the horror genre to its roots by celebrating visceral horror and the slow, fearful creep of dread. Sounds very promising. But following the game's release on Nintendo Switch, the game got tangled in a controversy on the cesspool that is Twitter. A certain loud minority were upset about Sense being ported to Switch, lying how the game has porn in it, making outrageous claims how this misogynistic game encourages violence on women and children in real life. Some even sent death threats to developers and basically demanded the game to be censored. And some even claimed that the game somehow breaks the law if it's released on Nintendo Switch. Maybe they thought that Switch was meant for kids only. Not only is it hilariously untrue, but it also seems that these people in question somehow missed mature Switch games with blood, gore and even sexual content like these two, and no one complained back then. Why had they pointed fingers at Sense specifically then? Because the female protagonist has a large rack. That's it. As far as I could tell, that's basically why. Top Hat Studios then made this statement on Twitter, stating that all these claims were false, how they value developers' artistic freedom, and thus refused to categorically censor the game. What's even more amusing is that this publicity seemed to help the game's sales and review ratings more than anything. Why do I mention this controversy? Because I am one of the people who bought and played Sense after reading the publisher's statement. And as someone who has played through the game from start to finish, twice, I can tell you that there is no porn of any kind in this game. Some of the outfits are skimpy and revealing, but that's it. But to be clear, I am not the type of person who buys games from publishers or developers just because they said something that I like on social media. If their games don't interest me, I don't buy them. In fact, I already knew about Sense before all of this. I thought it looked interesting and that I should pick it up and play sometime in the future. So all this controversy did at the end of the day was make me buy and play the game earlier. Of course, no matter how much I admire Top Hat Studios' stance against censorship and the Twitter mob, that doesn't mean I won't be critical about the game. So, is there anything to criticize about the game itself? Short answer, yes. Long answer, my name is Siperos and these are my thoughts on Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story. The story takes place in Neo Hong Kong in year 2083. Our protagonist is Mei Ling Mak, who is supposed to have a date with someone at a bar called Oasis. As we make our way to the bar, we see a little bit of the highly advanced, cyberpunk-like dystopian city and its inhabitants, who are almost half machines, having replaced their limbs with robotic prosthetics or improved their looks with enhancements and certain augments. Mei even has cybernetic eyes that are directly linked to her PDA device. Despite the advanced technology and changes in society, the old Chinese religious tradition still lives strongly in people's lives. Once we get inside the bar, Mei's eyes start to malfunction and she goes to a restroom to check them out. Once determined that nothing is wrong with her eyes and leaves the restroom, she realizes that she is not at the bar anymore, but in what seems to be an abandoned old building, all alone with no other, at least a living soul in sight. As you try to find a way out, you learn that you are inside an old apartment building from 1980s, with everything left untouched since its abandonment. It's essentially a large and of course haunted a century-old time capsule. Naturally, your objective is to find your way out of the building, while also learn about the past residents who last lived there, about their struggles and problems in life, and help their tortured souls to move on to the afterlife by making offerings to them. The story of Sense is serviceable, but also an intriguing mix of cyberpunk themes, various East Asian cultures, and Cantonese folklore. Although I must admit that even after playing through the game twice, I am still not exactly sure what happened that led the entire building with all its residents getting cursed for 100 years. If you are like me and don't know much about Cantonese folklore or Taoist exorcism rituals, a lot of things said in the game will just go right over your head. I would say that the subplots regarding the restless spirits of the past residents are more relatable and memorable than the main storyline. I also think the location where Susaku decided to tell the ghost story, an apartment building, is perhaps the most uninteresting and mundane place compared to things we have seen in other horror games, like gothic castles, fancy mansions, and literal ghost towns. To the story's credit though, an apartment building is more relatable, and maybe that was the point. And I found the tormented lost spirits and their backgrounds and interactions with the other past residents interesting. However, I don't think the developers did enough with the whole cyberpunk theme. We only really see how highly advanced and futuristic Hong Kong is at the start and end of the game when we are outside. In fact, if the game had started inside the apartment building right away, I don't think I could have told that this is supposed to be a futuristic dystopian cyberpunk setting. The only giveaway of that, besides the game's title, are the visible lines on May's face you see in cutscenes, indicating that she's a cyborg or an android of sorts. But once we are inside the building from the 1980s, it also feels like we are in the 1980s, and cyberpunk-like tech is not utilized practically at all, outside of using your PDA device to check your inventory, picked up documents and diaries, the map, that honestly is not that useful, and unlocked costumes. May is a sweet, pure-hearted, shy, and nerdy kind of young woman with great assets. She starts out as any girl would in her sudden predicament, frightened and defenseless, desperately trying to find her way out. But as you progress through the floors of the building, she becomes more determined and confident, especially when she gets a Taomu sword to whack the evil spirits with, which I come back to later. But I must confess that, outside of her pretty looks, she didn't leave much of an impression on me as a character, and ended up as forgettable. She is voiced by Sayaka Mashiro, but mostly says one or two words occasionally, or even a whole sentence if the game feels generous, and thus her performance was not any more memorable.
No! I am not going to die here.
The other characters, namely the ghosts of the former residents, 14 in total, are more developed, each with their own regrets, desires and troublesome past that they have written about in their diaries. Some of them used to be good but flawed people in life, like Sally, who was obsessed with womanly beauty, plastic surgeries, and worked as a courtesan but also had a crush on one of the other residents. Some were more twisted and messed up in the head even when they were alive. Dr. Light being perhaps the worst. A surgeon whose hobbies included murdering gang members and extracting their tattooed skins as trophies. My favorite ghost character is Young, better known by his nickname Lamppost, due to his unusual height caused by a rare genetic mutation that would have also killed the poor man in a few years. In life he was bullied and even assaulted by local youngsters, but never wanted to raise charges, thinking that a criminal record could ruin their lives, and overall was a shy, sympathetic and very nice man. And even as a restless spirit, he's still nice. Not only doesn't Lamppost try to attack you, but he's also such a pro that once you give him something that belongs to him, he helps you get to the next floor. I don't know if he moved on after that, but I sure hope he did. The game is 2.5D, backgrounds being 3D and characters 2D. Reminds me of Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night. Visually I think the game is appealing, using the lights and shadows well to make the derelict building feel even more eerie and haunting even before any moaning ghosts appear. The occasional random creepy spirit appearing briefly on the screen, things like doors shutting themselves and sounds of footsteps that are not yours keep up the tension. The cutscenes are shown in these comic book-like panels that look like they are from a colored manga. The only thing that bothered me a little was the stiff animation. For ghosts it works because it makes them seem unnatural and unnerving, but I think they should have made May's walking and running animation smoother and more natural. At least they focused their efforts on the animations that mattered the most. The gameplay design, however, leaves a lot to be desired. To me it felt like Sense tried to be an old-school survival horror game, and you could argue that technically it is, but the traditional survival horror mechanics are bare bones at best. First of all, there is a lot of backtracking in the game, which I don't mind in survival horror games. Resident Evil, for example, has a lot of backtracking as well. But not only does it take place in a large mansion that is more interesting to explore, it also has various types of enemies, like zombies, zombie dogs, spiders, and hunters to keep you occupied. Sense doesn't have anything like that. There is this one part in the game where these demonic gremlins appear after you get your Taomu sword, your only weapon in the game. But after this encounter, they never appear again in the hallways or other apartments. You use the sword on some of the resident spirits as well in mini boss fight-like encounters and to solve at least one puzzle, but other than that, there is very little actual fighting, which might be a good thing considering how clunky the fighting mechanics are, as you can probably tell. It's a mix of quick time events to dodge, do some other actions pressing E when close enough, or just whack them with the sword. The combat is not this game's strong suit, and thus, thankfully, there is not much of it. The last boss fight is also the easiest and most disappointing final boss fight that I have ever beaten in a video game. The main reason why you need to backtrack in the first place is to pick up some items you either missed or found earlier but couldn't pick them up because you didn't need them at the time. Now logically this makes sense. If you were in May's shoes, you wouldn't pick up a random red dodgeball unless you knew you were going to need it. Once you find this trap made of hair and determine that you need something with plenty of bounce to trigger it from a safe distance, you go back to where you saw the ball, pick it up, go back and use it. Speaking about using, you don't manually track and use items from your inventory. Instead, when interacting with an object, a door or something else, the game offers you different actions that you can perform. If you have the right item with you, the game offers the option to use it. Beware though, a few wrong actions that you can do will kill you. You can also die from doing things such as stepping into a puddle of electrified water or putting your hand in places you shouldn't. Some of the theft scenes are quite grotesque. Anyway, I can't help but feel that the reason for this design decision was to make the game artificially longer by making the player pointlessly backtrack instead of allowing them to pick up every pickable item they find, like in almost every other adventure game ever made. Sometimes you must even search or inspect stuff more than once before you find an item that you need. Why can't I just find the damn thing the first time? At least the game's text highlights some words or numbers indicating that this will be important to remember for later. The puzzle design is a simplistic mixed bag of convenience, as you don't need to manually try items to see if they work, but also inconvenience due to the backtracking and having to double check certain stuff to proceed. Back to the survival horror aspect, the other thing is the lack of resource management. There are only two meaningful resources in the game. The first ones being jade bracelets that protect you from single attacks from spirits. You can carry only 2 at a time, and if you run out and a spirit lands a hit on you, you must pass a QuickTime event to dodge it. Failure to do so leads to death. Then we got Betamax tapes that you use on Betamax players to save the game. So basically they are the ink ribbons and typewriters from the Resident Evil games. But the first time you play the game on standard mode, they literally don't matter. Because besides Betamax tapes, you can quick save the game anytime you want, and in addition there are checkpoints where the game auto-saves itself. This naturally baffled me. Were the developers unable to decide whether to let players save whenever they want or to make saving resource-based? After beating the game once, I learned that on New Game Plus mode you can only save by using Betamax tapes and reaching checkpoints. And on New Game Plus Plus mode, the game can only be saved by using tapes. That's why, and because I learned that there is more content on higher difficulties and you can unlock more costumes, I decided to give the game a second go. Now, after finishing the game on New Game Plus mode, I think it was a mistake to let players quick save freely on standard mode. It removes tension from the game. The second time is, of course, not as scary or tense as the first time since you know what's ahead of you. But knowing that you can only save reliably using Betamax tapes made the experience in my opinion better. More frustrating if you die and must load the last manual or autosave from an hour ago, sure, but that's why the game also feels more tense as you try not to die. The New Game Plus mode does have some extra content, like this evil spirit here that I am quite sure was not here on standard mode, and by dealing with her I got a new costume. There are supposedly 12 costumes in the game, and I managed to unlock most of them. Besides your default costume with the yellow jacket, that reminds me of that one chick from the X-Men, you have one with no jacket and more worn, beaten up versions of both. If you think May desperately needs some extra on the top, you have that option as well. Then you have Net Diver May, Kunoichi or Female Ninja, traditional Chinese dress, and Yang Shi, aka a Chinese vampire costume. There is also a bikini swimsuit and something called Judo that I missed. My favorite costume is the Ushi, or cowgirl, that you get by ordering milk tea from the vending machine in the laundry room. But outside of that, the second playthrough did not feel that much different. They could have added some extra steps to the puzzles, like the Curse of Monkey Island did in its Mega Monkey mode. After beating the game for the first time, I also unlocked this short side story called Yotsuya, that is about May's ancestor, Miri, taking place in 1970s Japan, which explains how Miri, and thus May, received the ability to see spirits. I didn't feel like playing through the game for a third time, but I understood that New Game Plus Plus, besides only being able to save manually with tapes, has some secrets of its own exclusive to that mode. I know it has a secret ending, which I watched on YouTube, and honestly, if I had played the game 3 times just to see the secret ending, I would have been disappointed because to me, it was nothing special and not worth the trouble of playing essentially the same game 3 times. Even if the game itself is not that long. It can easily be beaten in about 10 hours if you take your time or less first time around. Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story is a perfectly mediocre game. If I gave numerical scores to games in these videos, I would give Sense 2.5 out of 5 or 5 out of 10. The whole game is a mixed bag for me. The main storyline went over my head, and May, outside of her looks, is not a very compelling or memorable character. But the ghostly residents, their backstories and subplots were more intriguing and relatable. The mix of highly advanced cyberpunk technology and traditional Cantonese folklore and culture is interesting, but they didn't really utilize the former most of the game. The survival horror mechanics are there but also bare bones. The puzzle design is not bad, I remember even liking some of the puzzles, but it could have been better without all the pointless backtracking. And I think the standard mode you must beat the game on first is an inferior experience compared to New Game Plus and undoubtedly New Game Plus Plus mode. But at least each mode is slightly harder as far as saving goes and have some extra content to offer, like the additional costumes. So not great, but not a terrible game either. If you're into horror games with big titty anime waifu protagonists, then I think that picking up Saints when it's on sale is definitely worth it. The full price is about $20. But if you're still on the fence about it and need another good reason to spend your money and play this game yourself, then, well, I don't mean to get too political here, but I would say that to support a publisher and developer who are anti-censorship and support artistic freedom is always a good reason to buy it. But of course if, and I mean if, you think it's the kind of game you would enjoy. I hope my thoughts on the game helped you to decide on that. And there you go folks, those were my thoughts on Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story. What are your thoughts on the game? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.